Have a Bible and you're going to read with us. We're going to take a reading from 1 Samuel, and typically I try to read the whole passage and then talk through it afterward, but I don't want to do that this morning. I want to kind of go bits and pieces through this text, and I appreciate what Brother Matthew said as he was testifying this morning. He was kind of pulling on a thread that I'm going to pull as hard as I can, and that is the sovereignty of God. The title of my message this morning is The Reward of Trusting God's Sovereignty. The reward of trusting God's sovereignty. Now, sovereignty sounds like a $10 word, and it's not. As I was studying early in the week, I found this. This is a book called The Attributes of God by Arthur Pink, and it's fine. There's a lot of good books that you can read, especially older ones that talk about the attributes of God. I'll encourage you in your own study. If you're ever looking for somewhere to start, starting with the attributes of God is a wonderful place to study any kind of Bible study. Because remember, in the end, everything about the Bible is trying to point us towards knowing God. So it would be helpful if it just takes different parts of his character, different parts of who he is, and it just talks about it, a lot of these things. And if you ever need recommendation for that, I'd be happy to get you the resources because it's a wonderfully encouraging thing. This particular definition, I'm not going to say it's, just the greatest thing I've ever read, but it does the trick. It really does a good job just succinctly describing what we're going to talk about this morning when we use the term sovereignty. Now, in my mind, when I hear the word sovereignty, it immediately translates into all-powerful. That's what I immediately hear. That's not a perfect, but in the sense of a synonym, I think that's helpful as I listen to people say that word. I will just say as a very quick side note, I think that word has largely been contaminated in the last number of years from a doctrinal standpoint. And I'm not going to address that this morning. I think a lot of those brothers who use sovereignty to talk about, God controlling us and determining things, I think many of them are well-intended, and I don't feel the need today to try to pick a fight with that. But I don't mean it the way they do. I do believe as we're speaking about God's power this morning, I may say some things that give you the impression that I'm saying God determines, as in controls us, and I don't mean that. If it comes out that way, I don't want it to. And so I kind of wanted to give that brief disclaimer, but before we get to our text, I just, again, want to give you kind of a definition of this because it's going to be a big part of what we talk about today. The sovereignty of God may be defined as the exercise of his supremacy, being infinitely elevated above the highest creature. He is the Most High, Lord of heaven and earth, subject to none, influenced by none, absolutely independent. God does as he pleases, only as he pleases, always as he pleases. None can thwart him, none can hinder him. So his own word expressly declares, "My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." Isaiah 46:10. He doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. Daniel 4:35. Divine sovereignty means that God is God, in fact, as well as in name, that he is on the throne of the universe, directing all things, working all things, quote, after the counsel of his own will. Ephesians 1:11. Now again, I hope you can see from that definition, God is in complete control of himself and everything else. I told you last week as we were looking at this book that some of what we're wanting to do over these next few weeks perhaps is to give you a contrast to help us see both through the book of 1 Samuel and also within ourselves, that life is often presented to us in the form of two contrasting paths. And sin of any shape and form, the longer that I study sin and the longer that I practice sin, the more I become aware of how the tentacles of sin are almost never ending, or the cascading effects of sin go so far. There's so many ripples to sin. And I think in a culture which really emphasizes, from a political standpoint, from a relational standpoint, autonomy and independence and freedom, those are values that we justifiably esteem and we're thankful for. And I'm thankful that God has given us those things. However, those things can be taken too far. Those things can infect our attitude towards God. And once we begin to explore those things, a natural byproduct of accepting that we are free human beings, that God in His sovereign design has made us free human beings to make decisions and choices. And the Bible speaks of instruction for those choices to us. Do this and don't do this. And when a culture begins to circulate, or rather, when a culture begins to really press into the idea of freedom and making choices, one of the many cascading effects is that even in a good effort to search out the will of God, we can become very focused on what we need to do. And I want to be really clear, I'm not condemning that. I'm saying we can take that too far, where our minds begin to just constantly meditate and think on, what do I do? And if I don't do this, what will happen? And this is my fault, or this is not my fault, or this is this person's fault. And we can get really caught up trafficking in the idea that ultimately what happens to us or what happens in the world is the result of the causes and effects from our decisions alone. Now, I don't think that we actually think that or believe that, but we can live with that mentality that God is just hands off, and that Satan can take that and put, and this is what I really want to lean into this morning, he can put undue pressure on you to always do, feel, think, act right, and to study what you need to do and always be in this state of intense or obsessive concern for whether you are or are not doing the right thing. And in the middle of that thought, I want to make the plain statement that God is sovereign. God is in control, period. And I will not try to untangle this morning the connection between human responsibility and God's sovereignty. But what I will say is that people who focus on man's responsibility often leads them to obsessing about control. We use the term, I don't know if you can say this from the pulpit, control freak, right? And we can also say that in a, I care about the details. And some of those behaviors can be very helpful to human flourishing. And they can be very corrosive to spiritual maturity. So if that defines you today, there's a chance that an input that you really need from the scriptures is God is sovereign. He's in control. People who tend to overemphasize God's sovereignty can often grow complacent because the attitude then becomes, well, if God's in control, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And I don't think the scriptures teach that either. I'm not going to try to thread that needle this morning, but I think it's a necessary corollary to what we're talking about. Preface to what we're talking about. That what you do matters, but we tend to overemphasize that. So now let's talk about God's sovereignty through the lens of what's going on here. And also how, as I was studying this earlier this week and meditating upon this, I found just such a tremendous comfort in the knowledge and on meditating upon the fact that God is in control. If you're someone who struggles with anxiety, you need to bring this close. You need to bring this concept real close to your heart. You need to find scriptures that you can routinely go back. I thought of one, I marked it here. It says this: whatsoever the Lord pleased, that did he, in heaven, earth, sea, and all the deep places. God does what he wants. God does what he wants. He will do what he wants. No man will thwart that. Your failure can't stop that. I don't care how much you dig your heels in and determine what you're going to do. You use the term stubborn. I don't care how stubborn you are. God is going to do what he wants. Man is under the illusion that he has mastered medicine. He hasn't, and he never will. God is sovereign. It was interesting to me that the last reported conversation, hot mic moment that was caught by President Xi and President Putin. You know what they were talking about? Go back and look at it. The path to having discovered immortality. Two great leaders in communist nations. You know what they're worried about? Ultimately, in their hearts, enough to talk about? They got to die too. Now, this book that we're looking at, I mean, I know I say this sometimes and I feel silly almost, but like everything about this book is perfect. Like 1 Samuel. It's so good. And the more that you see like God's character through even the way that he writes what he's trying to tell us is just so beautiful in illustrating the character of God. That in this chapter and through this book, we're going to see God's sovereignty is present very much. And what we're going to read as you go through this book is you're going to read like the tectonic plates are shifting in the world. Both in Israel and outside of Israel, right? So you have a transition occurring within this book from one form of government, the judges, to a kingdom. That's a big deal. If we were to move from some form of government, actually the last time we did, it was kind of a big deal for our country, right? Really big deal. And when countries do that, there are so many things that are impacted. And last week we read, I believe it's the 8th chapter that talked about some of those changes and some of the profound ways it was going to impact their culture forever. We read about the change of the priesthood, which to us in this modern day is very foreign, but there's a literal shift from Eli and his children and grandchildren and the line where the priesthood would be led through. And at the very beginning of the book, we learn of this drastic shift that's going to occur, that Eli is not going to pass on the priesthood to Hophni and Phinehas, his sons, because of their wickedness. It's going to jump into Samuel's line. And so we see a big shift there. We watch David and Goliath. And again, that story that even for unreligious people has made a worldwide impact to understanding the small guy versus the great one, the righteous versus the wicked. That occurs in this chapter. We see a divided kingdom once we get into 2 Samuel where David is lifted up in the throne, and God is going to use that through the whole Bible, all the way through Revelation, to help depict the King Jesus that is today reigning in heaven. And Revelation is full of all these pictures, and those pictures and metaphors, many of them begin in the book of 1 Samuel, where a kingdom is established and the characteristics of a kingdom are established. And David, this man who has attributes coming from Bethlehem and being a young ruddy boy and facing the giant, all of those things are beautiful symbolisms that are meant to depict with great clarity Jesus and what he would do spiritually through his ministry. And I could go on and on listing all the things that the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel does, that the impact of which is great, but I want to point out something, that none of that is where it begins. The book begins. God does not start the story with all of these tectonic plates shaking and crashing and all of the effects that it would have. God starts with a lowly barren woman. I love that that's how the book of Luke starts. Same exact way. Like, God is born. And so John chapter 1 seems to be a very appropriate way to announce God being born. In the beginning was the Word, and eventually it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. And there's such majesty in John 1 to get us to consider the eternal proportions of God coming to earth. And from a natural standpoint, it would seem like that's where you would begin to take note of the sovereignty and power of our great God. And yet the book of Luke gives us a different shade of God's character, very similar to 1 Samuel, that it begins with the story of a virtue that God esteems in us. Humility. God giveth grace to the humble. God sees the downtrodden and the brokenhearted. And so all of these great things that 1 Samuel is going to address nonetheless starts with the simplicity of a woman who's hurting. And if I take something from that, it is this: God cares when we hurt. I mean, it's simple. There's many takeaways we can take. But as 1 Peter tells us, cast all your cares upon him, for he careth for you. And so we notice in the first 20 verses that a prominent thing that keeps coming up over and over and over is that though we have a sovereign God who sustains everything by the word of his power, who human beings will never be able to see with their naked eye the end of his creation, or never be able to discern the microscopic complexity of his creation, despite all of those things and despite all the affairs of men, which we lump and say those things are important and they're interesting, I want us to also know about our sovereign God, that he cares about us. He cares about your suffering. He cares about you. And as your pastor, I'm privy to many of your suffering that your fellow church members are not. And I want you to know, I'm speaking to those of you who I know. God cares about you. He sees you just like he sees Hannah. And in the midst of all the questioning, I want you to know and take confidence from this scripture, from this story, that God's sovereign power and God's sovereign plan has not let up in your life one iota at all. As forsaken as you feel. Isn't that great about reading the Psalms? I love what God did with the Psalms. I love that David's an emotional guy, isn't he? I remember when somebody told me that one time. It helped me so much because you know what? When I go before the Lord, sometimes I feel like a basket case. And in both directions. Sometimes I feel such happiness and glee and I'm all excited, and before the day is over, I'm questioning everything about life. It really bothered me. It made me think maybe I'm just immature and something's wrong. And I remember somebody saying, but that's how David was his whole life. Just read the Psalms. Wow, that is true. The personality and the expression of those things, if they're taken to the Lord, are an expression of you. And Hannah here is this emotional and downtrodden, and she just takes it to the Lord. This morning, God's sovereign power and his concerns with the affairs of this life, you're a part of that. He cares. And so in the first two verses, we learn about these two ladies. And I want to bring this up because this is, I look at like some of the truths of the Bible are hard to understand because it's almost like you throw all these ingredients into a big pot and then it's just all mixed around. And then what we try to do is take out each ingredient and understand it. And sometimes you can't. Like human responsibility and God's sovereignty, and then national Israel's sin in permitting polygamy. Like that's a part of this story, right? And so often we kind of go through the Old Testament and say, why did God allow polygamy, and why this, and how does that make sense with the New Testament, and why didn't God just reveal at the time? And the answer fundamentally that I'll give you is I don't know. I don't know why. I think there's some helpful explanations, but what I do know about the story is that it is built upon Israel's national sin of becoming like the nations around them. That's what all the judges are about. And so here's what I'm wanting you to see. Hannah's pain is somewhat endemic to just the situation around her. Like she had no control. Men married multiple wives. That was a built-in part of culture. And that is going to exacerbate her pain tremendously. And she could, perhaps, I doubt she could have because she wouldn't even known this necessarily. Lord, why did you allow our society, why did you allow our church, why did you allow our religious mindset to deteriorate such a point that we're not even practicing the fundamental rights? And she could have taken the imperfections of all the systems that were set up around her and used the fact that God was not correcting all those things to accuse him of injustice. Because what we're going to learn, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in verse 7, notice that it says this, and as he did so year by year. So if you read the whole context of that, two ladies, Peninnah, Hannah, go with their husband. My whole life I've said Elkanah, but I actually came to learn it's Elkanah, so I'm probably going to say it wrong permanently, right? Elkanah, he has two wives. They go to the temple every year like they're commanded to do. They go to worship every year like they're commanded to do and make sacrifices. Peninnah has all these children and he gives her all these offerings to take. And there's a festive element to what they're doing, right? So it's not just to the Lord, that's what it's supposed to be, but there's also a festive element, a cultural element added to their sacrifice. And so it's this joyful thing to do, but you don't just do it yourself, you do it with those you love, right? You're coming to the temple and you're offering this thing to God together. And as they're going every year, Peninnah knows the sorrow of her rival. That's how she looks at her, as her rival, Hannah. He can see that Elkanah prefers Hannah. Again, just another layer of sin on the whole complexity of the situation. So she's taunting and I really broke into what she was doing and how it's described in the original Hebrew, and I'm not comfortable enough to say it, but it seems to me like an element of it is like the language used, if I understood it correctly, if I was using a good resource, was that like the attitude of Peninnah towards Hannah was the same language you use of the Philistines towards Israel when they're trying to kill them. So it's like military intensity. So this isn't just like trying to say some subtle things that might hurt her feelings. She is deliberately trying to destroy the heart of Hannah. It's what she's doing in her provocations. And she's doing it, verse 7 says, year after year after year. So I would imagine if you've lost someone, we always say that whenever somebody dies, the holiday seasons are the worst because their absence is most notable. So evidently, from a cultural element, them going to sacrifice every year, the time when it would have been the hardest on a woman who was barren was when all the children are walking up and giving their offerings and the family affair is taking place and she has no children. And that's the time where her rival would make her plight most painful. So we see Hannah here. She's hurting. She's deeply hurting. But now I thought of this in our day. Here's what we'd all told Hannah to do. And I'm not saying this is wrong, but I think it's incomplete. We just say, well, have you gone to the OBGYN? Have you figured out whether it's chronic illness, whether it's hormonal, whether it's anatomical? Would you have done all those things? And there's a whole Christian ethical discussion to have about all of those things. But I will say this, I think often people, not just in this narrow area, and not just in the area of biology and medicine, but in a lot of areas of life, we run to human beings to tell us the what. What is happening? Why did I get this illness? And they might be able to accurately track it. Well, this was your diet and you smoked for this long, or you took this substance that you shouldn't have took when you were a kid, and you have this genetic explanation. And they give us all the what. But here's what I have found in my own life, but in particular in listening to other people, even when they get an answer for the what, it never satisfies them. Because what is behind all the searching is not the what, but the why. That's what they want to know. Why did God allow me to go out and slip on the ice and forever impair my life? Why did God allow this hard thing to take place? And I'll tell you this, men will never give you the answer. Why? Because God is sovereign. God is in control. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not discouraging you from perhaps discovering those things, but I am discouraging you from the expectation that from discovering that you will be at peace. You won't. You won't be at peace. Because looking in the situation, and I'm kind of curious, what was it about Hannah that made her not be able to bear children? There is a medical explanation, most likely. But let's look at what the Bible teaches us. The greater narrative is going on here is not about the desires of men, it's about the will of God. Look at what it says in verse 5. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, or a double portion, more than what he gave to Peninnah and her children. For he loved Hannah. Look at the end of verse 5. But the Lord had shut up her womb. Let's keep reading. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. Now, you can see, this is not my emphasis, this is the emphasis of the text. The reason she wasn't having children is because of God. This is sensitive territory to anybody who struggled in this area in your life. And I don't tread on that lightly. I don't casually use an example. the degree to which that something like that affects your life is more pronounced than I can understand. We could say the same thing about those of you who have suffered loss, be it from children, spouses, friends. We could say that about those who have been left forever changed by accident, by an accident that you had, or forever scarred from a previous relationship that you've had. God saw it all. God knew it all. God is sovereign. And so how do we reconcile these things? And in the situation of Hannah, I believe the picture just becomes so clear that very often the picture that we're looking at is so incomplete that there's no way by looking at things through the lenses of our own eyes that we could ever come to understand the why that God has in mind. Nonetheless, God gives us, in the midst of our ignorance, some assurances that we can cling to as to properties of His why, characteristics of His why. Here's one of the characteristics of His why, and one that people quote, probably the most quoted after John 3:16, Romans 8:28. What do we know about God's sovereign will in the midst of our lives? That no matter how deep the suffering gets, no matter how confusing a state that we are left in as a result of all the things, what does His promise tell us as an anchor to the soul that we can know about the sovereignty of God? For all things work together for good to them that love the Lord and are the called according to His purpose. That little 3-letter word, isn't it powerful? He didn't say most things. He didn't say godly things, religious things. All things work together for those that love the Lord and are the called according to His purpose. Here's something. Now, you have to have this as an anchor of your soul. That verse, you have to have it as an anchor of your soul. It's not optional for the Christian. Not like God is mandating you will only survive if you have that as an anchor for your soul. All things work together for good. You ever been in a situation and thought about that verse and then looked at your situation and said, how in the world could this be working together for my good? That place, we're going to hopefully get to it. I take forever to get to where I'm going. It is in that place that is actually the reward of trusting God's sovereignty. Where we're trying to get this morning is this. Total surrender is the reward of trusting God's sovereignty. That's the reward. Is being in a state before God of total surrender. I've used it once here before in preaching. I remember doing it, but it's such a keen example to me about this truth, total surrender. The Japanese people during World War II, whether you thought it was a good idea or not, what it required for them to get to the place of total surrender was 2 nuclear bombs before they would give total surrender. And I've thought about that as a metaphor many times in my own life. We dropped one, and guess what? They were still ready to fight. Nobody else probably cares about this, but it's always fascinating. And I say this not like lightly, it's just how horrific that those nuclear bombs were. At the point of impact, we're solids. You go from solid to liquid to gas. It got so hot that those people vaporized immediately from solid to gas. That's how horrific that event was, not counting all the incredible human suffering otherwise. And the will of Japan was still so proud, they would not surrender. And man, the Lord has used that in my own heart, that knowledge so many times. How many bombs is it going to take to break you? And the strange thing is that I want to be broken. Like, that's the thing that is so fascinating about human beings, right? Like, take your child. Let's go to Hannah, right? You want your child to be the Lord's, don't you? I bet if I went through every parent tonight and said, do you want your child to do the will of the Lord? Every one of you would say, yes, I do. Are you willing, and are you willing for your child to be required to endure whatever is necessary for them to be brought to a place of total surrender so that they will do the will of the Lord, and so will you? I would be very desirous to hear if you feel like this is a right interpretation of this story, because I think what has come out to me about this story is this. Really, verse 11 is the key to unlocking this whole story. Before Hannah was born, God wanted Samuel as his. God had a will for Samuel's life. He wanted Samuel to be surrendered to him so that God's sovereign plan could be carried out in the world. That's what God wanted. I don't need to try to understand that. I want the will of God. And if my child God has called out for a task, big or small, I want him or her to fulfill that task. God had a desire for Samuel's life. But what it would require is to accomplish that was for Samuel's mother to willfully hand Samuel over. That needed to occur for Samuel's life to be what it was. Now, uncustomary is an understatement. It was uncustomary to just go drop your 3-year-old off at the temple and say, he's yours. If Hannah was like most ladies today, and I mean this with all due respect and not trying to put salt on the wound, often idolatry is revealed when God gives us what we've prayed for, how we respond to that. If you can't bear children, then all of a sudden you get one, be careful of idolatry. I'm not accusing him, I'm just saying be careful, right? Because then it's very easy to just worship at the feet of the child. And all the while deceiving self that you're actually doing good because it's God's blessing. It is God's blessing, but it's not meant to replace the Lord. Hannah, I don't know this. I would assume she's just a mortal woman just like anybody else, would have the temptation perhaps to go a prolonged period of barrenness and then all of a sudden have a child and then begin to esteem that child. The Lord allowed her barrenness to continue and to continue and to continue. And then we get to verse 11. And listen to her prayer. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou will indeed look on the affliction of thy handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thy handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. I can't help but see the events of Hannah and Samuel's life through the prism of verse 11, that was God's desire. He was driving Hannah. He was allowing all of these things to occur in Hannah's life to a climactic driving point, and that driving point was not success. It was not the child itself. It was the point of surrender. Now, I really feel like this requires this is really important. Whatever it is you're after, if that has become the desire over complete surrender to God, it's misplaced. God wants his children. Part of the reason he wants total surrender is because of the depth of love that can be experienced through the point of total surrender. It is there that we learn truly that God is sovereign. Because we're not trying to control. We're not trying to idolize. We're not trying to do what we want to do. We are in a state of total abandonment of self and a desire after him. And that is what God esteems. That is what God delights in his people. Amen. And so the reward of trusting in the sovereignty of God is you get to truly pray, not with your lips, but with your heart. God, if you give me this, it is completely yours. I have no will of my own. And isn't that what Jesus teaches us, perhaps foremost in the Garden of Gethsemane? Did he not even himself, God on earth, submit to the Father in heaven and come to a place that he wanted all of us to know about when he stands in prayer, when all else had fallen away, when all else were sleeping, when all else were cumbered about with fear? Did he not come to a place with his Father where he showed us that the desired effect for the human race is a place of total surrender? There he was in the garden saying, this is not my will, but it's thine be done. And he submitted even to the death of the cross, even to the suffering of sin, even to all that he endured, that he might bring about many sons into the kingdom of his Father and deliver them there. You see the reward of trusting God's sovereignty. Oh, we can talk about a peace, and that is a reward. There's many things there's not just one spoil when we conquer principalities and powers and sins. There's not just one blessing that we inherit. If you surrender to God's sovereignty, I will say that there probably will be a moment where you'll inherit some peace, where you might rediscover the joy of his salvation. And praise God for that. I love those moments, don't you? When God restores and renews the joys of salvation. And suddenly you hear the birds that you hear that annoy you, and they begin to sing the praises of God. And he's renewed you. Suddenly you're driving down the road by yourself and you're singing from your heart. Oh, that's a blessing of trusting God's sovereignty. The lack of worry, isn't that a blessing of trusting God's sovereignty? You ever had that experience before, Christian friend? Oh, you were cumbered about with all number of trials and anxieties. And then suddenly God helped you to surrender. And all those things just floated away. And you could rest. Oh, I go through that periodically. I can't sleep. And then God gives me peace. Oh, I sleep so good. I wake up cheerful in the morning. Really, like I'm cheerful. That's a blessing from God. A cheerful heart. Suddenly I love people more. That's a blessing of trusting in God's sovereignty. You know, you don't have to worry about controlling everything. You can just love each other. You don't have to worry about whether the person will take advantage of you and because you trust God's sovereignty. You just get to love them. None of the fears that go around it, you'll just love them. Because you know in those moments, whether you recognize, you're knowing in those moments that ultimately God is on the throne in control. And there is nothing that I will do to disrupt God's will. It's such a beautiful, it's something I'm trying to describe, but being there is better. But the greatest, the source, the fountain of all of those things is the state of surrender itself. What does Hannah do? I love this. She follows through with her word. I'm reading this into the text, so take that in. I think when you get to this has been my experience at least, and I could show some examples in Scripture of this. When you get to the place of total surrender, what leads up to is the battle of your heart, right? The battle between control and trust. And let me say this, that battle is complex, man. It's far more complex than we even realize it is. Why? Because our hearts are deceitful and wicked. You know who they deceive first? Us. They deceive us. And as Sister Megan testified last week, I believe it was, they have some help too. They got some satanic powers that do some help. So sometimes you can even be under the illusion that you're at total surrender, and you're not. I've had that happen before. I've told you this before. I remember one time where I was just starting out preaching, and I'd been around Brother Phil Mail a little too much, and I was getting pretty confident about how I was willing to be bold with people, and I was feeling real good about myself. I mean, really, that's what I was feeling really prideful about myself, that, I'll do whatever God tells me to do. I don't care what it is. I remember it was Christmas time, and we were at the mall. Now, for our young people, the mall used to be busy, right? Especially during Christmas time. And I was sitting there and I was eating by myself. I was about 18. The Lord said, get up and preach now. My head got all hot. Started saying, no, God wouldn't have me do this, right? I've been convinced now that He didn't ever intend for me to get up and preach. You know what He intended to do? Reveal that I wasn't as surrendered as what I thought I was. Always stayed with me. That experience has always stayed. And occasionally I'll get places and I'll have that thought. Would I get up and preach here if God told me to? Am I totally surrendered? Now, that's a personal example to reveal the complexity of our hearts from total surrender. You know what I think happened with Hannah? She really totally surrendered. And you creep up to that line of total surrender, and you go through loops, and you go through cycles, and you go through all these things. And then God helps you to cross the Rubicon, and you actually totally surrender. Then that thing is not a fear, it's a blessing. Penina went to the temple year after year with her children, and they made an offer of all those animals. But one year, you know what Hannah did? She didn't bring an animal. You know what she brought? Her son. And 1,000,000 animals could not have been greater than bringing her son. I tend to believe, this is where I'm reading into the text, she had crossed the line of total surrender in verse 11 years earlier. So by the time she got to this, she brought her son with joy. Some of you parents probably know this. I know you know better than I did because I'm not there yet. Like that weird joy of like your kid growing up and being ready to move out and be on their own, and you're so proud of who they've become, and you would do nothing to stop that, but you're just sad. You're just sad because what was will never be. Like, that's how I imagine what's happening here. It's like, I'm not saying she was walking away shouting, because there was natural sorrow. And I will happen to note this, that God probably gave her a little buffer from that sorrow because she ended up having a lot more children, which is just a side issue. But she went, she offered it to the Lord. And I believe the blessing of knowing that her son was fully surrendered to God for his service, willfully by God's grace on her part, far exceeded the natural sorrow of seeing him live far away. This morning, here's the duality I want to place before you, and I'm done. We can live in a world of our minds where we so overthink everything about our decision making and what we do and don't do and how that will affect the world and God's will for our life. I've been there and I go there often, far too often. Or we can choose to live in the real world. God is sovereign. He's in control. And he delegates to us responsibility to carry out his behalf. But ultimately, Callan here lately, he's gotten interested in money. So he thinks he can buy anything with $1, just so you know, okay? I think that's a pretty fitting analogy, right? God entrusts us with $1. That's it. I don't give him my checkbook just because he's curious about $1 or just because he can steward $1 well. I give him, just like the parable of the talents, in proportion to his ability. And God has done that with you. God has given you life in according to what he deems you needful to be responsible for. And none of that will cause his plan to go bankrupt. He's going to do what he wants to accomplish. This morning, I take great courage. Comfort would be the better word. God is in control of all things. That little boy Samuel went to the temple. Look at what God had planned for his life. Beautiful. It started at the point of true surrender. There's a reward for getting to the place of believing and trusting in God's sovereignty, and that is to a state of total surrender. I'm thankful for that this morning. That's our thoughts today. I hope it'll be helpful to you. I hope it'll especially be helpful to those of you who are undergoing change in your life. For whatever reason, don't fail to trust the power and sovereignty of God, whatever the change might be.